He controlled more of Europe than any man since Caesar, and he threw it all away trying to win a war he'd already lost at sea. The Continental System was supposed to strangle Britain. Instead, it strangled Napoleon. He controlled more of Europe than any man since Caesar. His armies had humiliated Austria, obliterated Prussia, and forced Russia to the negotiating table. His name alone moved markets and toppled governments. And he threw it all away, trying to win a war he had already lost at sea. By 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the peak of his power. The board was his. The pieces were his. The map of Europe was, in nearly every direction, painted French. So he made a move. One move, strategic, sweeping, designed to bring his last remaining enemy, Britain, to its knees without firing a single shot. It was called the Continental System, and it was the deadliest gambit in modern European history. Not because it was too bold, but because it worked just well enough to keep him committed, and failed in exactly the way that cost him everything. This is the story of how the greatest commander of his age played the wrong game, on the wrong board, for the wrong prize, and broke Europe in the process. To understand the move, you have to understand the position on the board. By late 1805, Napoleon had just scored one of the most decisive military victories in recorded history. At the Battle of Austerlitz, he shattered an Austro-Russian force in under 9 hours. The Austrian Empire sued for peace. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 1,000 years, ceased to exist shortly after. Napoleon dissolved it personally. On land, he was untouchable. But there was a problem, a massive, floating, island-shaped problem. Britain. Britain was the engine behind every coalition against Napoleon. The British government didn't just oppose him, it funded the opposition. Gold from London bought Prussian armies, sustained Austrian resistance, and kept the coalitions forming and reforming like waves against a shoreline. Napoleon could defeat the waves. He couldn't stop the tide. And he couldn't touch the source, because 6 weeks before Austerlitz, the British Royal Navy had ended that possibility forever. At the Battle of Trafalgar, on October 21st, 1805, Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the combined Franco-Spanish fleet. France lost 22 ships. Britain lost none. The dream of invading England, which Napoleon had spent years preparing, died in the Atlantic off the Spanish coast. Here is where a different kind of commander might have accepted the strategic reality. Britain was unreachable by force. A negotiated peace, a managed rivalry, a long-term containment strategy, these were all available options. Napoleon chose none of them. He chose the Gambit. On November 21st, 1806, standing in Berlin, a city he had just conquered, Napoleon issued what would become the most consequential piece of paper he ever signed, the Berlin Decree. In one document, he declared the entire British Isles to be in a state of blockade, not a naval blockade, he didn't have the navy for that, an economic blockade. He forbade every nation under French control or influence from importing British goods, corresponding with British merchants, or trading with British ships. He called it the Continental System. The logic was clean, almost elegant. Britain was, in Napoleon's words, an island of shopkeepers. Its economy ran on trade. If you cut off its markets, all of Europe at once, you dry up its revenue. No revenue, no money to fund coalitions. No coalitions, no wars. No wars, and Napoleon's empire stabilizes permanently. It was economic strangulation as grand strategy. On paper, it looked like checkmate in 3 moves. Here is the first thing most history books get wrong about this moment. The Continental System was not an act of desperation. It was a position of strength. Napoleon controlled most of Western and Central Europe. He had just forced Russia into an alliance at Tilsit. He had client states from Spain to Poland. He had the pieces. He had the board. The Gambit looked sound. But there were 3 fatal assumptions buried inside it, and each one would eventually cost him an army. The first assumption, that Britain couldn't survive without European markets. Napoleon was wrong, and he was wrong almost immediately. Yes, British exports to the continent fell. Estimates range from 25% to 55% in the first years of the blockade. That hurt. British merchants felt real pain. There were economic crises in 1810 and 1811 that caused genuine instability. But Britain did something Napoleon didn't account for. It pivoted. British merchants, cut off from Europe, turned west and south. Trade with Latin America surged. New markets in Asia expanded. Britain's colonial network, which Napoleon had no ability to threaten, absorbed the shock. The Industrial Revolution, which was accelerating rapidly in Britain during this exact period, kept manufacturing output climbing, even as export routes narrowed. And then there was smuggling. Smuggling became the Continental System's open wound that never closed. British goods flooded the continent through Portugal, Sweden, neutral ships, and corrupt officials. Napoleon's customs enforcement was land-based. He had no maritime police force capable of patrolling thousands of miles of European coastline. And the corruption was stunning in its scale. Napoleon's own marshals were profiting from it. Marshal Massena reportedly made 3 million francs from contraband while posted in Italy. Marshal Murat, King of Naples, looked the other way as British goods flowed through his ports. Marshal Bernadotte, the man Napoleon had made Crown Prince of Sweden, openly defied the system by 1812, restoring trade with both Britain and Russia. The blockade was leaking from the day it was declared. Britain was not dying. It was adapting. But Napoleon couldn't see it clearly, or wouldn't. So he did what overextended commanders throughout history have done when a plan isn't working. He doubled down. This is where the Gambit stops being a failed economic strategy and starts being an empire-ending catastrophe. Because when Napoleon decided to enforce the Continental System by force, when he decided that non-compliance meant invasion, he stepped into a trap he had laid for himself. The first nail in the coffin was Portugal. Portugal had been Britain's oldest ally. When Napoleon demanded that Portugal comply with the Continental System and seize British ships in its ports, the Portuguese regent stalled, negotiated, and ultimately refused. Napoleon's response was swift and, in retrospect, suicidal. He sent an army through Spain to occupy Portugal and enforce the blockade personally. That army crossed into Spain in the fall of 1807. Portugal fell quickly. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil. Mission accomplished, on paper. But something happened in Spain that Napoleon did not predict, could not predict, and never fully understood until it was too late. The Spanish people rose up. Napoleon had used Spain as a corridor. He'd stationed troops there, demanded support, and when the Spanish royal family fell into a political crisis of their own, he seized the opportunity, deposed the Spanish king, and installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. He thought this was clever. Another piece on the board, another client state secured. What he actually did was ignite a firestorm. The Spanish didn't fight Napoleon the way other European nations did. They didn't line up armies on open fields. They disappeared into mountains and cities and struck from shadows. Ambushes, assassinations, supply line raids. The kind of war that Napoleon's Grande Armée, designed for rapid, decisive, open-field victories, had no doctrine to handle. It became known as the Peninsular War. Napoleon himself later called Spain his Spanish ulcer, an open wound that would not close, would not heal, and continuously drained blood from the French body. And crucially, Britain found its opening. A British general named Arthur Wellesley, who you might know by his later title, the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and began a methodical, patient campaign that would last 6 years. Wellington didn't try to out-Napoleon Napoleon. He played a different game entirely. He held defensible terrain, struck when the odds favored him, and let the guerrillas do the bleeding work between engagements. It was a masterclass in strategic patience, and it worked. Over the course of the Peninsular War, France would lose somewhere over 200,000 soldiers, not in one catastrophic defeat, in a slow, grinding 6-year attrition. A wound that wouldn't kill fast, but wouldn't stop bleeding. And here is the critical point that gets overlooked. Napoleon's army in Spain wasn't surplus. It wasn't a second team. Those were elite veterans, experienced officers, and massive quantities of supplies, all locked down in a peninsula, fighting an unwinnable insurgency, unavailable for any other theater of war. The board Napoleon thought he controlled was being dismantled, piece by piece, in a country he'd annexed to enforce a blockade that wasn't working. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The second country to break the Continental System was Russia. The irony here is deep. At the treaties of Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had stood on a raft in the middle of a river, a famous theatrical meeting, and Alexander had agreed to join the Continental System. It looked like a diplomatic triumph. But Russia's economy ran on trade. It exported grain and raw materials, and it imported manufactured goods. Britain was Russia's largest trading partner. Cutting that relationship off was economically devastating for Russian landowners, the very aristocratic class whose support Alexander needed to maintain his throne. By 1810, Russia was quietly reopening trade with Britain. Neutral ships, creative reclassification of goods, a blind eye turned at the border. The Continental System was hemorrhaging in the east as badly as it was in the west. Napoleon knew. His intelligence network was clear, and his response, once again, was to interpret non-compliance as a military problem rather than a political reality. If Russia wouldn't comply, Russia would be forced to comply. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army in European history up to that point, roughly 600,000 men drawn from across the empire and allied nations. The Grande Armée. It crossed into Russia. What followed was not a campaign. It was an extinction event for French military power. The Russians didn't stand and fight at the border. They retreated, and retreated, and retreated, drawing Napoleon deeper into the vast Russian interior, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point, scorching the earth behind them so the invaders found nothing to eat. Napoleon reached Moscow in September 1812. The city was largely abandoned and then set on fire by retreating Russians. He waited for Alexander to send peace terms. The terms never came. He had nowhere left to advance. He had no supply lines he could rely on. And the Russian winter, that patient, indifferent executioner, was coming. The retreat from Moscow was among the most catastrophic military disasters in history. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Disease, starvation, and enemy raids shredded the Grande Armée as it stumbled back toward France. Of the 600,000 men who crossed into Russia in the summer of 1812, historians estimate that fewer than 100,000 returned in any fighting condition. After Russia, the board collapsed with stunning speed. Prussia, which had been humiliated and controlled by France since 1806, saw its opportunity and switched sides. Austria, which had been a reluctant French ally, mobilized against Napoleon. Sweden, with Bernadotte now openly hostile, joined the coalition. The Sixth Coalition, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and the remnants of Spanish resistance, converged on France from multiple directions simultaneously. But the board had changed irreversibly. He no longer had the pieces. The Russia campaign had wiped them out. The Peninsular War had bled him for 6 years. And Britain, which was supposed to be economically ruined by the Continental System, was financing and supplying every army marching toward Paris. In October 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon was surrounded and decisively defeated. Over 90,000 French soldiers were casualties. Paris fell in March 1814. Napoleon abdicated. The Gambit had run its full course. Here is what most histories miss when they tell this story. The Continental System is usually presented as a failed policy, a good idea badly executed. The argument goes, Napoleon had the right instinct, attacking Britain economically, but couldn't enforce the blockade. If only he'd had a stronger navy, a more reliable network of allies, a tighter grip on smuggling, it might have worked. That interpretation is too generous. The real strategic failure was deeper. Napoleon misidentified his position on the board. He thought he was in an attacking position against Britain, that he held the initiative, and the Continental System was his offensive weapon. In reality, he was already in a fundamentally defensive position the moment Trafalgar ended his naval options. Britain was unreachable. The correct move, the patient, positional move, was to consolidate what he had, manage his alliances, accept the draw, and build French power over decades. Instead, he played for the knockout. He needed to win, completely, decisively, fast. That need for total victory, for the definitive strategic finish, is what chess players call playing for mate, when the position only offers an equal endgame. It looks aggressive, it feels like strength, but it overextends your pieces, weakens your position, and eventually hands the advantage to the opponent who simply waits. Britain waited. Spain bled him. Russia absorbed him. The coalition finished him. And the Continental System, his deadliest gambit, was the single decision that set all three consequences in motion simultaneously. There is also a note here relevant to American viewers. Britain's counter-blockade, its orders in council restricting neutral shipping, directly interfered with American trade. American ships were stopped, boarded, and seized. American sailors were pressed into British service. That interference, made worse by the economic chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, was among the leading causes of the War of 1812, the only war in U.S. history in which the American capital was captured and burned by a foreign power. Napoleon's Gambit, in other words, eventually reached American shores. When Napoleon finally fell in 1815, and the statesmen of Europe gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map, Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the undisputed dominant power on Earth. Its economy had not collapsed. Its navy controlled every major sea lane. Its industrial revolution was accelerating faster than any European rival could match. The British century, the long, extraordinary period of British global dominance, was beginning. Napoleon had tried to break Britain. Britain had not broken. Instead, the attempt broke Napoleon's empire, shattered the Grande Armée, destabilized the entire continental political order, killed hundreds of thousands of people across Spain and Russia and Central Europe, and ultimately left France weaker than when the wars began. The Continental System stands as one of history's most instructive strategic catastrophes, not because it was reckless, but because it was logical. It made sense on paper. The pieces seemed to be there. The position seemed strong. But Napoleon violated the oldest rule in strategic thinking. Know which battles you can win and which ones you're already playing just to avoid admitting you've lost. He couldn't beat Britain at sea. He couldn't strangle it by land. He couldn't force a continent of sovereign peoples to bend their economies to his will indefinitely. Every attempt to close the gap opened two new ones. He played a gambit on a board he didn't control, against an opponent who didn't need to win, just needed to survive. And Britain survived. Napoleon didn't. The greatest general of his age was finally beaten, not by a better general, not by a smarter battle plan, but by an island of shopkeepers who simply refused to go bankrupt.